Okay, in these last couple of videos, we're going to be talking about the reproductive system, a male and female reproductive system, in 3 installments. The first installment here in this video is going to be just talking about the general basics of the reproductive system. And then in our second video, we'll be talking about the female reproductive system, particularly organs involved, as well as some physiology that goes along with the female reproductive system, which is actually pretty complex. And the third one, we'll be talking about the male reproductive system, okay, which is a little bit less complicated in some ways, but still also very important, because we need to have both the male and the female reproductive process and result in the continuation of a species. Okay, what we have, first thing, probably the best and most logical place to start is just talk about sexual reproduction. And sexual reproduction is a very simple thing, practically, in the sense that what happens, it's the merging of the nuclei of an ovum or eggs from a female and the nuclei of the spermatozoa or the sperm, the male sex cell. Okay, both the ovum and the sperm cells are called gametes. So if you look at the word gamete means either ovum or spermatozoa. So I'm going to outline gamete right here, ovum or spermatozoa. Now, there's a couple differences between the ovum and the spermatozoa. Okay, first is size. The ovum in females is huge. It's a very large cell as compared to the spermatozoa, probably 1,000 times greater in size than the spermatozoa. Second thing that's different in regards to the ovum and the spermatozoa besides size is the ovum are basically already there in the ovaries. Ovum are in, or the eggs are in the ovaries, and they're not continually made. Okay, what happens is each month, under the influence of some hormones from the pituitary, particularly one major one called FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, we have a certain limited number of ovum, which are actually in small containers inside the ovary called follicles. A certain number of these ovum are stimulated by this FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, to develop and to mature and ripen. Okay, so there's a set number of ovum that female have. On the other hand, spermatozoa are produced in the testes, and they're produced continually. From the time of puberty on to the time of death, males can continue to produce spermatozoa. So there's two big differences: size and availability. However, the third difference is probably not a difference. But what happens is both of them have a similarity, and this is where the similarity makes all the difference in the world. What happens is, if I look at all our typical normal cells, and we've talked about this when we talked about DNA and cells and stuff like that, each nucleus has chromosomes, okay? And we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Chromosome number 1 normally have 2 of those. Chromosome number 2, we have 2. Chromosome number 3, we have 2. Chromosome number 4, we have 2. So we have 2 of all these chromosomes all the way through 23 pairs. Okay, the 23rd pair of chromosomes is basically the sex chromosomes. In females, there's 2 X chromosomes, or an XX, which makes it female. And in male, it's an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. The Y makes it male. Now, that Y chromosome isn't just for male characteristics or anything like that, but there's a lot of other areas on that Y chromosome that we have that we could talk about probably when we talk about the male reproductive system. Certain things like certain diseases, like certain types of muscular dystrophy. Duchenne's muscular dystrophy is seen in males, and the reason why is the gene that's responsible for a particular protein is on the Y chromosome, and when it's abnormal, this dystrophin, it causes the muscular dystrophy to occur. So anyway, so each the similarities between an ovum and a spermatozoa is they don't have 23 pairs of chromosomes. What do they have? They have 1/2 of each pair. So in the spermatozoa, we have one of the pairs of the first chromosome, one of the pairs of the second, one of the pairs of the third, one of the pairs of the fourth, all the way down through 23. And we have the same thing in female: one of the pairs of the one of the pairs of the 2, one of the pairs of 3, one of the pairs of 4, all the way down through 23. When they unite, okay, they have 1/2 of each pair from the spermatozoa from the male, and 1/2 of each pair of the ovum, in the female, and they come together. Now I have 23 pair. Okay, so it's a complementary pair that will match. Okay, it makes, you know, a pair from each single of a pair. Okay, hopefully you understand that. And that 23rd being called the sex chromosome is actually relatively simple to understand. What happens in females, it's an XX, and males it's XY. So the female in half of each of those pairs is able to either give an X chromosome or an X chromosome. In the male, a male could either give an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. If the male gives an X and the female gives an X, they come together. I have two X's. That pair, that 23rd chromosome is an XX, therefore it's a female offspring. If in the ovum there's an X chromosome, which there has to be, and from the spermatozoa there's a Y chromosome, and they merge, and that pair, that 23rd pair, is now an XY. It'll be a male. Okay, so basically what we find is in sexual reproduction, when the gametes unite, we have now a full complementary supply of hereditary material, 23 full pairs of chromosomes. Okay, sometimes things happen wrong, and like we talk about in Down syndrome, it's a 21 trisomy. Instead of having 2, there's 3 for some reason. Okay, so, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about that if we get a chance down the road. But that's sexual reproduction, sort of like where it comes from. This is just a little image showing the difference. The image on the right. Okay, if you look at the image on the right, you know, the ovum is actually quite large as compared to a very small spermatozoa, and that's probably out of proportion even with that, simply because, again, the ovum is probably a magnitude of 1,000 times larger than the spermatozoa. Spermatozoa is very small. The image on the left is sort of like a little electron microscopy picture, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. Okay, so we talked before a word is called gametes. Gametes are basically the ovum and the spermatozoa. Where are they produced? Well, again, those gametes in the female are in the ovaries, and there's a set complement. You can't call out when you run out. In fact, what happens is when they finally get down to the end of the complements of ovum in the ovary, what happens at that point is that females start to enter into this period called menopause, where there's no longer a complement or a significant number of good ovum, and as a result, the need to produce certain hormones, particularly like estrogen, continues to go down. Okay, although, like we say in the males, these gametes can be produced for a lifetime, you know, and the spermatozoa are continued to be produced until the time males die. What happens, those gametes then leave the gonads. Okay, and the females, they're through the ovary, and through the males, it's basically from the testes, and it's a long series of tubes to be able to produce these spermatozoa, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get to the male reproductive system. Couple things about the ovaries and the ovum in females is we'll talk a little bit more about the physiology, and it's a very precise, very complicated workings of a number of different hormones that will actually create the right settings and the right atmosphere for an ovum to be produced, and also to prepare the uterus for possible implantation, is if there is a fertilization of the ovum by a spermatozoa. But what happens in the female, okay, as I mentioned before, under the influence of a hormone called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which is on a cyclical basis, which is coming from the pituitary, which we talked about in the endocrine system as well. We talked about it in the skeletal portion, in the hypophyseal fossa, in the neurological system. So we've talked about it multiple places. At the beginning of every cycle, what happens is this pituitary sends out a hormone called FSH, and FSH then gets in the circulation, because we know hormones are hematogenously spread. They're spread throughout the blood, and they go to the ovary, and the ovary then, it stimulates a certain limited number of follicles, and the follicle is a little container with an ovum inside for these follicles to develop, and that ovum gets larger and larger and larger and matures or ripens or gets ready for to be released. Okay, at the middle of the cycle, after they've gone through a period of time, maybe about 2 weeks, for this ovum continuing to develop and get bigger and bigger and bigger, that ovum with that follicle actually moves to the outer surface, migrates to the outer surface of the ovary. And in the middle of the cycle, what happens, that pituitary says, my job is up again, and sends out this big surge of another hormone called LH, or luteinizing hormone. The LH comes out. This LH surge actually causes something called ovulation to occur. And in ovulation, what happens is that ovum is then expelled through the wall of the ovary Okay, that's why sometimes females may actually have some mid-cycle cramping and stuff like that, and that's at the time of ovulation when it's expelled. In fact, what happens is to find when that ovulation occurs, one thing that does happen is taking temperature. So when someone is trying to find out when their most fertile period of time is, and they want to know when ovulation occurs, because again, there's a very short, narrow window after that in which pregnancy can occur. They take their temperature, and what they find is at the first half of the month the temperature is a low basal level, and then after that LH sort of is secreted, it causes other changes which causes the temperature to rise. So during the first half of the month, that basal temperature is at a lower level when they first thing in the morning, and then what will happen is at the time of ovulation it rises, and then it will stay like that at a higher level, probably because of the production of another hormone called progesterone, which is a little bit later. Okay, so anyway, so finally what happens at this time of ovulation, that ovum is expelled from the side wall of the uterus. Now, it might be one ovary, it might be both ovaries, might be one month, one month, one ovary, or another month, and it's only a limited number. It's not like a whole large number, and maybe that's one reason why the size of the ovum is so large, because the spermata is so small. There's probably more than a million spermatozoa ejaculated with each ejaculation, and therefore what happens is they're looking for the biggest target they could find. Okay, and that's that big ovum. Okay, because there's only a few of them. Okay, so as a result, they have to find this big cell in a large mass of the fallopian tube. Okay, so anyway, what happens is now when the ovum is expelled to the side of the ovary, next to it is a tube, and that tube is called the fallopian tube. At the end of the fallopian tube, there are little fingers, and these little fingers will sort of wave. They sort of wave like this. What they do is they sort of wave the ovum into the opening of the fallopian tube and down the fallopian tube. Here's something that's interesting to remember about the fallopian tube in females. It's basically open to the inside of the abdominal cavity. So you could actually get inside the abdominal cavity without having to puncture anything. It's basically through the vagina, up through the opening of the uterus, which is called the cervical os, through the endocervical canal, up the uterus, out the fallopian tube, and something could get inside the abdominal cavity without ever having to penetrate through the wall of anything. Okay, which is different males versus females. Males, there's no way to get inside the abdominal cavity anyway, where in females you could actually do that. Okay, but anyway, what happens is now that ovum is expelled from the ovary and is waved into the fallopian tube, starts to go down the fallopian tube. At that point, somewhere in the fallopian tube, if the situations are right and if there are spermatozoa present, that spermatozoa may actually find the ovum. On the head of the spermatozoa, it looks like a little tadpole, has a flagella coming out the back end, okay, a little tail, whip-like tail, flagella coming out the back end, has a small head, and on the head is basically a cap. And the cap has various enzymes. And what that cap will do is once it sees an ovum, it starts to beat that cap against the wall of the ovum, and eventually these enzymes are released, creates a weakness, and actually the spermatozoa can enter inside the ovum. At that point, we have what's called fertilization. What happens? Bingo. The 1/2 of each pair of the chromosomes from the spermatozoa now meet the 1/2 of each pair of those chromosomes from the ovum, and it meets together and creates these, and fertilization occurs. What happens with fertilization? Well, what happens, it makes one cell. That one cell then divides, becomes 2 cells. 2 cells become 4 cells. 4 cells become 8, and it increases that way. And that ball of cells, before it really takes any significant form, is called a zygote. So that's an important word to know. Is zygote's an important word to know as well. So zygote is an important word. Okay. So gamete, sex cell, ovum, or a spermatozoa, and the zygote is what's formed. Okay. And again, this just shows another picture. I think this is a little nicer picture, one you want to probably get a copy of it, hang over your mantle or something like that in your house, just for a conversation piece. But on the left, you can see that, an ovum and a spermatozoa, and that's probably a little bit out of representation. And then on the right, you could actually see the spermatozoa actually working their way in through the wall of the ovum on an electron microscopy picture. So what happens, fertilization is basically that union of the ovum and the spermatozoa, and now we have that mixing of that genetic material, 1/2 of each pair from the mother, 1/2 of each pair from the father, and then mix. Now I have a total complement of 23 pairs. Okay. What happens is once that zygote is made, that ball of cells, Inside the fallopian tube, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about the reproductive system a little bit more in detail. Inside the fallopian tube are small little fingers like called cilia. Remember the cilia in the lungs? We also have cilia in the fallopian tubes. So what happens is like I say, most fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube. Okay, and what happens is now that zygote starts to divide. It says, where do I go from here? What happens is the cilia then transport the zygote, continues to transport it down, and that cilia will beat in a direction towards the area of the uterus. So it carries the zygote down the wall of the fallopian tube until it gets to the area of the uterus where it drops into the uterus, which is called the cornua or horns. Okay, right at the edge where it's at the top of the uterus. You'll see that when we talk more about the female reproductive system. It's at the top portion of the uterus where the fallopian tubes enter into the uterine cavity. That zygote comes down the wall, starts to fall down the wall, and eventually, if the wall has been prepared well enough, that zygote will stick to the wall of the uterus, usually up high, very close to where the opening is from the fallopian tubes into the uterus. Okay, what happens is once that zygote attaches itself to the wall of the uterus, something is formed. Magic number 2 occurs. Magic number 2 is that what happens, it develops a band of tissue called the chorion, and that chorion will eventually further develop and becomes sort of like the basis of what eventually develops into what's called the placenta, as well as the amniotic sac, which will surround the area of the growing embryo, eventually fetus, zygote to embryo to fetus, okay? And that will be there. What happens is then that placenta becomes the lifeline between the growing human and the mother. The blood supply never mixes. The placenta, there's a membrane that's between the two, the placental membrane, that actually separates the fetal or the embryonic blood supply from the maternal blood supply. They don't mix or mingle, okay? However, smaller particles like nutrients, oxygen, materials like that, even some things like some antibodies, okay, and that becomes a significant point in what we call Rh negative moms. But the certain things that are of certain size are actually able to pass through that membrane from the maternal circulation into the fetal circulation. So this placenta is basically a very it's a blood-rich organ that's inside the wall of the uterus, or inside the inside lining of the uterus, okay, where the zygote, the embryo, and the fetus will get its nutrients from the maternal circulation, okay? And there's a lot more that actually goes on. What actually prepares the inside wall of the uterus to allow this implantation to occur is a very common hormone called estrogen. Estrogen makes the wall of the inside of the uterus, which is called the endometrium, thicker. Once that ovum is expelled from the ovary, that little gap where the ovum was fills with this yellow fatty material, which is called the corpus luteum. Corpus body, luteum, yellow. It's yellow body, yellow fatty body. And the corpus luteum helps to produce another hormone called progesterone, which makes the wall better and stickier. So what happens if we do have that fertilization, there's a nice good place for that zygote to stick to, okay? So that's how this occurs, where fertilization then becomes implantation, okay? And again, this is, and then what happens is a number of hormones are produced there. One of the interesting things too, I should mention here, and I'll mention it when the female reproductive system, is when we talked about the chorion. The chorion is the initial tissue that actually allows a connection between the zygote and the wall of the uterus, the endometrium, the inside wall of the uterus. And that chorion secretes a hormone in itself. It's called the human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. And that HCG levels rapidly rise. They start out like very small, but this thing gets active really early. The chorion and so starts to crank out all this HCG. The HCG then builds up, and it does a couple things. Number one, it feeds back to the pituitary. Remember we talked about something about negative feedback? It feeds back to the pituitary and says, hey, pituitary, I want to tell you this because you're going to be the first to know, probably before dad or grandma, mom, dad, anybody else know, but we're pregnant. Okay, pregnancy is there, and as a result, what happens is the FSH that stimulated the follicles from the development stops. It cuts off. So therefore, we can't have a pregnancy occurring a month after a pregnancy starts. So there's no pregnancy because of this. Okay. Also, that HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, starts to build up in the blood. As it builds up in the blood and things start to develop, the chorion eventually will develop into the rudimentary things that will eventually become things like the placenta and the amniotic sac. What happens is that also, as it builds up in the blood, some of it gets spilled over into the urine. If you go back to our urinary system PowerPoints, some of it gets spilled back over into the urine, and that's the basis of the home pregnancy test. What they're actually testing in the pregnancy test, when you take a little urine and look at the little stick and it either says yes or no, okay, is the amount of HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, in the urine. And if there is some, it means they're pregnant. Well, it could mean one other thing, but that's probably a lot more. Sometimes what happens is after the baby is born, if they have to deliver the placenta. The placenta is delivered after the baby is born, okay? And so the placenta comes out. If there's a part of the placenta that stays inside the uterus, it may actually transform itself into what's called a choriocarcinoma. And that choriocarcinoma will also secrete HCG. So as after pregnancy, if the HCG levels are up or something like that, you always worry about if there's a cancer developing inside the uterus from the part of a retained placenta. After the placenta is born, the docs and the nurses will always look at the placenta to make sure there's no little piece that's been pulled out. If there is, they have to get it out. Okay. Now you're asking me now, what happens if there is no fertilization? Well, if there's no fertilization, something else happens. At the end of that 28 days, or actually before that, a little bit before that, a few days before that, if there's no fertilization, that corpus luteum stops. Okay, and it's not putting much feedback to the brain or anything else back. And what happens is the level of estrogen and progesterone, which are increased, now start to fall. And when those levels of estrogen and progesterone fall, it causes that inside lining of the uterus, which was made thicker by estrogen and made better by progesterone, says, what's the sense in being here? You know, they don't need me. Okay, as a result, what happens, it gets sloughed off. Actually, it's sort of interesting because what actually that decreased slide in estrogen actually causes a release of something we've mentioned before in a couple other video PowerPoints, something called prostaglandins. And the prostaglandins in the uterine wall actually cause the blood vessels to spasm up. That's why females sometimes get premenstrual cramping. Why? Because the prostaglandins are causing the vessels to squeeze up, decreasing the blood supply to the endometrium. Then the endometrium sort of dies and sloughs off. And what's that? That's menses. That's why females who have premenstrual cramping, what do they take? They take an anti-inflammatory such as Advil, Naproxen, something like that. Why? Because they block prostaglandins. If they block the prostaglandins, it takes away that cramping and stuff like that. So anyway, if there's no fertilization, the wall doesn't want to get thicker and thicker and thicker each month. It says, hey, you know what? We didn't have it happen this month, so let's try again next month, and the uterine wall is shed. The endometrial wall comes off the inside of the uterus and with the bleeding, and as a result, that's called menstruation. And that's where that all goes to. So anyway, that's what happens in a nutshell. Now, estrogen and progesterone are both produced in the ovary. Okay, estrogen, like I mentioned, is a very important hormone physiologically, simply because the estrogen is what actually thickens the wall, the endometrium, the inside wall of the uterus. It makes it thicker, okay? It makes it so that there's a more cushy place for that zygote to land to if there is fertilization, okay? Progesterone, like I mentioned, is made once the ovum is expelled. What we'll find is that corpus luteum sort of augments the production of this progesterone from the ovary, and the progesterone makes the inside lining that's been made thicker by estrogen, makes it better, makes it stickier, makes it more glandular, makes it a better environment for that zygote to be able to stick to. And that's what happens with the estrogen and progesterone. Now, one other thing I should mention is estrogen is exceptionally close in chemical structure to testosterone. And we're going to see this relationship in a couple situations. Males who are older that take testosterone supplements for that low T syndrome, okay, what we actually find is sometimes if you're sitting up late at night studying and cramming for an exam, you'll see this thing from a law firm. If you, as a male, have taken testosterone supplementations for low T syndrome and have developed female breasts, call our law offices, and it's called gynecomastia. What happens is that happens, and it's not something that hasn't been explained. It's been explained. Somebody's just trying to make a couple bucks off of it. But what happens, it has been explained. Why? Because what happens is sometimes in males a certain enzyme becomes started, okay, epigenetically, which means certain genes get turned on or turned off at various points in our life. And sometimes epigenetically, this gene for making a certain enzyme called aromatase gets turned on. Aromatase takes testosterone and converts it into estrogen, or augments the estrogen, okay? And that's what happens with that. So as a result, you know, that sometimes that may happen because of this aromatase. In fact, if you watch any commercials for some of these treatments for breast cancer, if you have a breast cancer that's been aromatase positive, well, aromatase positive breast cancers mean they produce more estrogen, and some types of breast cancers are estrogen is a stimulant for that, okay? So anyway, that's a little bit about estrogen. Also, what happens, we find females with certain what's called polycystic ovary disease. They have lots of cysts, and what they think may happen with ovarian cysts is a follicle might not have had an ovum in it, but the FSH stimulates it. It starts to develop, but it's an empty follicle and fills with fluid. And if there's nothing to expel, nothing gets expelled, and therefore this follicle remains as just a fluid-filled mass. And females who have polycystic ovaries means they have multiple of these. What they find is the levels of estrogen in females with polycystic ovaries is high. And because that level of estrogen is high, guess what happens to some of that estrogen? It gets converted over to testosterone. That's why sometimes females with polycystic ovary disease might have a little bit more might have a difficult time getting pregnant. Why? Because the testosterone is feeding back. The high level of estrogen is making a lot of testosterone that feeds back to the pituitary to tell the pituitary no FSH. Okay? And that's why sometimes in females with polycystic ovaries, what do you see? They start to develop facial hair. Not as much as this, but they start to develop facial hair, which is called hirsutism, because the testosterone levels are high, because the estrogen level was high, and some of the estrogen then got reconverted back over into testosterone. Okay, so both the estrogen and progesterone are produced in the ovary. And again, both of them are very important in both menstruation and pregnancy. Pregnancy because they prepare the uterus, menstruation because the uterus was prepared. But what happens is they found that there was no need for it, and they redo it again. Let's try this again next month. Okay, and they try it again next month, and things happen like that. Okay. Also, it's funny because, well, it's not funny, but it's ironic in the sense that what happens is in the past, females who had repeated miscarriages, and the medical word for miscarriage is a spontaneous abortion. Okay, females who have had miscarriages, spontaneous abortions, frequently what they'll do is one of the things that they'll look for is they look for their progesterone level. If the estrogen level might be high, but if they're not putting out much progesterone, what happens is they may have to do something that will supplement that to allow them to continue to make enough progesterone to make the wall of the uterus, the endometrial wall, better as compared to thicker. Thicker estrogen, better progesterone. Okay. Years ago, a long time ago, probably in the 60s and maybe the 70s, they used a drug called DES, which was diethylstilbestrol, to help with this. And what they found was, guess what? A lot of the females who were having spontaneous abortions, miscarriages, were able to take and can carry a child to full term, which is a good thing. Here's what they didn't recognize is multiple years later that when they looked at the female offspring of females who took DES, there was a higher than normal incidence of vaginal cancers. a certain type of cancer, it was a higher percentage. They don't use much DES anymore. They still use the supplement, but not much, okay? So we know that the estrogen and progesterone are essential in this overall cycle. Also, estrogen and progesterone are important in the development of secondary sex characteristics, such as deposition of fat, development of breasts, hair patterns, and stuff like that. And again, so estrogen and progesterone are important, but we also know, like we talked about, the pituitary gland is really important because of the need for developing things, hormones such as FSH, which stimulates the follicles to allow them to get bigger and the ovum to mature inside those follicles, as well as LH, which produces that stimulus for ovulation, as well as sort of stimulates that open area in the ovary that after the ovum is expelled to develop that yellow material, that corpus luteum. Okay, so that's what the LH, the luteinizing hormone, helps to do, helps to sort of push that along. Okay, so anyway, that's what we also think, such as the development of the ovaries, breasts, and uterus are also under the influence of the pituitary gland in other ways. Okay, what happens is if there should be a pregnancy, okay, there's a certain amount of time that it takes for that zygote to become an embryo, and from that embryo to become a fetus. Okay. People always talk about the miracle of being able to produce a life from an ovum and a sperm that get together. And to be truthful with it, yeah, that is sort of awe-inspiring. But what's more awe-inspiring when you think about it is what happens from that point. That's an instant. What happens from that point for the next 40 weeks? To me, that's even much more amazing. We go from one cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to 8 cells to 16 to 32, and we keep on getting bigger, but not just the multiplication of the cells, because that's explainable. What is really more amazing is that how those cells will start to develop, or what we call differentiate. Differentiate is what makes some cells all of a sudden become this part of the body, and this structure becomes these group of cells, and these become this, okay? And a lot of that has to do with what we call stem cells. Stem cells, underneath the right stimulus, are able to produce whatever they want to produce, or whatever they're told to produce is a better way to put it, okay? So that, to me, is more amazing, how things occur in such a regular, reproducible way with so few errors that, you know, even though we're all different, there are so many things in us that are alike. If we're all healthy, there's a lot of things working the right way. Why? Because there was some differentiation, something that happened in that 40 weeks that allowed that differentiation to occur. To me, that's mind-boggling. That's something that I better stop thinking about now, or I won't be able to sleep tonight. Okay. So anyway, what we talk about is the word we want to mention is gestation, and gestation is the period of time that the living human being, let me put it that way, is developed inside the uterus. Okay, well, it's, you know, it's developing is probably a better way. The developing human being, and that's, well, we all know that as pregnancy. After the first couple weeks, things start to change. Again, we have that zygote. That zygote is that first ball of cells that keeps on getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But basically, it's an amorphous mass of cells, and that's all it is. Finally, at about 2 weeks, things start to change. We have some cells that say, I think I'm going to become something in the respiratory system. Good idea. I think I'm going to be something in the cardiovascular system. Good idea. Oh, neurological system. We need a and something in the GI system. We start to see a differentiation of the different types of cells to become different things in that first 2 to 4 weeks, or 2 to 6 weeks after the zygote. So we're about 8 weeks, maybe even up to about 10 weeks, depending. There's no like dividing line that says, yeah, this is an embryo and this is a fetus, but things happen, okay? So we have that embryo, and then during the embryo, it doesn't really look all that humanistic. Okay, it looks maybe like a small, very small miniature tadpole type of thing. We start to develop about the 6th week, we start to develop arm buds or limb buds. At the end of this, or it'd probably be about 8 weeks at this point, 6 to 8 weeks, we start to develop little limb buds. You know, 2 in the for the upper extremities, 2 for the lower extremities. Finally, what happens is the development, or the development of structures and organ systems becomes a little bit more intricate, and at that point, we go from being an embryo to what's called a fetus. Okay, and that fetus remains there for the rest of the time of confinement. They call it the EDC, estimated date of confinement. Sounds like when you get born, it's sort of like a parole. Okay, but basically the estimated date of confinement is basically the due date when the baby is finally mature enough to be able to be born. And we know that I know my younger son was a 6-week preemie, and there are things that were different from him as compared to my other son, which was actually about a week after the due date. Okay, but anyway, there are differences. But during this basically 40 weeks, 9 months that we have is where all things happen. Okay, to try to get from just starting out with 2 isolated cells, an ovum and a spermatozoa, to mix and mingle to become a zygote. That zygote to multiply its number of cells to where those cells say, hey, it's time to do something a little different, and they start to go in a different way, where it becomes an embryo, where we get the early origins of everything happening, and finally to become a fetus, where they're trying to fine-tune things and other things are developing. Interesting thing enough too, is when they look at this pregnancy, this gestational period, what they actually realize is we could divide it into segments. The first 3 months are called the first trimester, the middle 3 months are called the middle trimester, and the last 3 months are called the third trimester, or late trimester. Okay, and it turns out that in that first 3 months, during that first trimester, there are so many things happening and so many things, new things developing, and so many things going on that it becomes an exceptionally vulnerable period of time. Okay, when you get into taking x-rays, there'll usually be a sign saying for females, if you when was your last menstrual period, or if you think you might be pregnant, let the technologist know. And the reason why is if it's early on, the x-rays, because they have a great tendency to be able to penetrate body tissues, may cause some changes in that developing embryo more so than the fetus, or they may cause some changes of a process that's occurring. Okay, as a result, that's why they avoid doing x-rays in pregnant females. Why? Because there's always something happening. The most vulnerable time would be that first trimester. The second most vulnerable time would be the second trimester, and probably the least vulnerable time would be the third trimester, but there's still maybe things that may be developing, like fingernails, hair, and stuff like that later on. All the big stuff is probably in by the third trimester and is working on its way, but that's why they avoid x-rays during pregnancy, because of that reason. It's actually also estimated there are probably a lot more pregnancies than we know about. And what do I mean by that? What happens is sometimes someone will say that they're a couple days late, or they're a week late, and all of a sudden they have their menses and say, phew, dodged a bullet if they didn't want to have a baby, or they get sad because they're not pregnant, which one of the two ways. Okay, what they actually find is that sometimes during that first couple days of that zygote, and when that zygote is trying to implant, there might be a problem with implantation. Okay, it doesn't implant, like the progesterone being low or something like that, or the wall of the uterus wasn't prepared well enough that month, or whatever the case may be. Or it might be that there's some external environmental factors, such as pollutants, medications. That's why I tell pregnant females not to take medications unless it's specifically approved by their doc. Okay, because some of these medications will affect that development of the zygote, embryo, and fetus, and will actually cause destruction. And what happens is, if there is something environmentally, by medications, actually even food, certain types of cheese and stuff like that may cause a problem. If there is something that will cause a problem that may actually be significantly impairing to the zygote, embryo, or fetus, then what happens is that zygote, embryo, or fetus, we're not the fetus, but the zygote, embryo may spontaneously abort. Okay, so that was one of the problems that we see, that sometimes it occurs more than what we think about. Okay, and this is just like a nice little cute picture of showing a fetus going on, stuff like that, so you can actually look at that and sort of, And this is again a little bit later, going actually from 5 weeks, which is going to be an embryo here on the far left, to 14 weeks. Now we're into the fetal portion, and here's 20 weeks, which is about halfway through. 20 weeks, you start to see a lot of development of a lot of things. 14 weeks, you still see a lot. At about 14 weeks, you can be able to start to hear the heart, beat, 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 beat. Actually, a lot faster. Beat, 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 beat. A lot faster than that. So you actually start to hear a lot of stuff. You can hear it with ultrasound and stuff like that early, or with a fetoscope or a stethoscope, probably about 18 to 20 weeks. So it has to go through a long way to be able to get there, and it's very faint. Okay, so that's a little bit later. And now we're finally a little bit closer to term. You can actually see in this one here, you can see the umbilical cord coming out this way, and you're starting to see a lot more humanistic characteristics. If you've had a child, or if you've a relative with a child and they get the 3D ultrasounds, my gosh, they look like somebody crawled inside with a little camera and took a little snapshot. That's what you see. But that's what we start to see as it goes on. So what I want to mention here, just to tidy this one up, is there are significant differences. This all starts with the merging of a spermatozoa and an ovum, that each, during the course of development, we'll talk about the development of the spermatozoa in the male in a bunch of tubules in the testes. And again, in the females, the ovum are already there. They're in a follicle, which is a container, and that follicle will develop, okay, under the influence of that FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. What happens is they have half of each pair of chromosomes, okay? And then what happens is that when fertilization occurs, half of each pair get together. Now I have a full pair of each chromosomes, and as a result, that's what causes this fertilization. That's the result of this fertilization. The cells then, at the cell after it's fertilized with the spermatozoa depositing this material and mixing with the chromosomal material of the ovum, is a zygote. That zygote continues to grow and multiply just in cells, amorphous cells, 2, 4, 8 to 16, 16 to 32, 32 to 64, blah, 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 gets bigger and bigger over the first couple of weeks. And then all of a sudden, what will happen is things start to say, hey, I want something different, and we start to develop this embryo, or we start to develop various characteristics. Limb buds develop about 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and they start to develop. We start to get the rudimentary structure of various organ systems will start. And then finally we get into that fetal period of time, which is the majority of the time that we have, which lasts for a long time, the rest of that 40 weeks, until the baby is ready to be delivered at some point. We talked about the fact that how this is all under significant hormonal control, both from the area of the pituitary with the FSH and the LH, as well as from the ovary in regards to estrogen and progesterone. In the male, the production of spermatozoa is under the influence of testosterone. I will mention before I forget, there are a couple other hormones that the pituitary also has an influence on in the female reproductive system. From the anterior pituitary, because we talked about that in the neurological portion or in the endocrine portion, from the anterior pituitary, there's a hormone called prolactin, and prolactin is a hormone that will actually be released after delivery that stimulates the development of breast milk. Okay. Also from the posterior pituitary in females, there's another hormone that's released from there. It's called oxytocin, and oxytocin is basically the hormone that actually stimulates the uterine contractions, makes the uterine wall contract to be able to force that fetus out through the birth canal, and that's called oxytocin. Sometimes if they want to hasten delivery, what they do is, instead of waiting for the oxytocin to kick in, because sometimes it's a little slow, saying, you know what, this is going to be tough enough, give me a time. What they do is they'll give what's called a Pitocin drip, which is a synthetic like oxytocin material that will do the same thing as the oxytocin, and they just drip that in, and the uterine contractions then get really bad. And basically that's what we're talking about. Now we're up at 40 weeks, and at 40 weeks the child is pretty much matured. Again, I mentioned like in previous videos that what we find is the fetus isn't always as 100% mature as we want. It's not 100%. Okay, I like a new pen which actually writes really well. It's not 100% like the liver. You know, it takes sometimes a little while for that liver to get caught on, and other things. We talk about preemies, okay, and one of the problems with the preemies is the what? The lung, like we talked about before, are those pneumocytes type 2, the type 2 pneumocytes that make the surfactant aren't working. So basically there's lots of stuff that happens during that 40 weeks that results in a child. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next PowerPoint video in regards to the female reproductive system, various structures, and we'll go over a little bit again the hormonal relationships that you'll have there as well. Okay, so in the meantime, Think about what we talked about, and be safe and be healthy.